Have you ever wondered what becomes of the people who once believed in us when no one else did? The ones who saw light where others saw only trouble. Sometimes life takes those quiet heroes and buries them under years of silence until fate decides it's time for a reckoning. The morning sky over Maple Ridge was heavy with clouds that looked ready to break. The wind carried the scent of rain and gasoline, and somewhere beyond the hills, a low rumble began to rise. Not thunder, but something far more deliberate. Dozens of engines roaring in unison, cutting through the mist like a storm made of steel and memory. Inside a small wooden house at the edge of town, an elderly woman pressed her palm against the glass, trying to understand why the road itself seemed to be trembling. Her name was Eleanor Reed, a retired teacher who had spent most of her life believing that kindness could still change the course of a life. Years ago, she defended a boy everyone else had already given up on, the son of a notorious biker who spent more time behind bars than at home. People warned her to stay away, said she was risking her career for a lost cause, but Eleanor saw something in the boy's eyes that no record could erase. A spark of decency, buried beneath anger and shame. Now, decades later, that same boy, grown into a man the world still misjudged by his leather jacket and scars, was on his way back. And he wasn't coming alone. What you're about to discover now may surprise you. This isn't just a story about a teacher or a biker. It's about the invisible threads that tie lives together, sometimes for decades, waiting for the right moment to pull them back into alignment. It's about redemption, loyalty, and moral justice, the kind that doesn't come from laws or judges, but from the human heart. Out there on the open road, the engines grew louder, echoing through the empty streets. The townsfolk peeked through their curtains, uncertain if they should be afraid or stand in awe. To them, the sight was almost biblical. A sea of black jackets and chrome cutting through the rain like an army of ghosts. Each man carried his own story of pain, loss, and forgiveness, and they all rode for one reason. Meanwhile, Eleanor sat at her kitchen table, surrounded by half-packed boxes and unpaid bills. The eviction notice lay on top of a stack of old report cards, her handwriting still neat and careful. She didn't know that her quiet act of compassion years ago had started. Something far greater than she could have imagined, a movement of honor among the very men society had once feared. Have you ever met someone who changed your path without even realizing it? Someone whose belief in you became the reason you stood back up when life tried to bury you? Stay with me until the end, because this story isn't just about a single act of kindness. It's about how that kindness can echo across time, reaching people who never forgot what it felt like to be seen. The storm outside grew stronger. The sound of engines merged with the thunder above, until it became impossible to tell which came from the sky and which came from the road. Eleanor rose from her chair, heart pounding, as headlights pierced through the rain. For a moment it looked as if the past itself had come riding out of the darkness. And among those riders, one man slowed his bike, eyes fixed on the house ahead. He remembered every word she'd spoken to him, every time she'd told him he was more than his last mistake. And this time, he was here to prove her right. The engines roared closer, the ground began to shake, and what happened next, no one in that town would ever forget. Maybe that's the part that moves me most about stories like this. How one act of courage, one quiet decision to care, can ripple through time and find its way back when you least expect it. Mrs. Reed had no idea that a single moment of compassion could turn into an army of engines riding through the storm. And maybe that's a reminder for all of us, that kindness doesn't vanish, it waits, it circles back, and sometimes it arrives with headlights cutting through the rain. If this story has already stirred something inside you, maybe a memory of someone who once believed in you, or a moment when you were that person for someone else, I'd love to hear it. Tell me in the comments below. Every story shared here keeps this community alive. It turns this channel into more than just a place for videos. It becomes a space where real people meet through stories of redemption, empathy, and second chances. And if this kind of storytelling speaks to you, if you believe that even in dark times there's still light worth fighting for, go ahead and hit the like button. It's a small gesture, but it tells the platform that stories like this matter. It helps these messages reach more people who might need a reminder that hope still exists in unexpected places. If you're new here, or if you've been quietly watching from the sidelines, consider subscribing, not just to follow the next video, but to walk this road with us through tales of justice, compassion, and the kind of redemption that only the human heart can create. Each subscription helps keep these stories alive, gives them a chance to echo further, and maybe, just maybe, to change someone's day. Because that's what this space is really about. People who still believe that goodness can roar louder than hate, that strength can wear leather and still have a heart, so stay close. The storm outside hasn't passed yet, and what comes next will show that sometimes the loudest sound of love is the rumble of engines returning home. The engines faded into the distance of the storm, but to understand what truly brought them there, we have to go back, years before that morning, when everything started in a small town called Maple Ridge, tucked between forgotten highways and tired fields. It wasn't a place people dreamed of moving. It was the kind of town people quietly survived in. The school sat at the edge of Main Street, a red brick building with paint peeling from its windowsills and a flag that hung limp even on breezy days. Inside, the hallways smelled faintly of chalk and old wood, and laughter rarely made it past the first bell. That's where Eleanor Reed spent most of her life. She wasn't the kind of teacher who tried to be everyone's friend, nor the one who demanded blind respect. She was something rarer. Steady, observant, and quietly fierce. She believed that education wasn't just about numbers on a test, but about dignity, about teaching a child that their worth couldn't be graded. And in that school, among dozens of restless kids, there was one who seemed to test that belief every single day, Jake Miller. Jake sat in the back row, hood up, eyes down. He didn't talk much, but when he did, his tone carried a sharp edge, like he was always one word away from a fight. Rumors about him spread faster than truth ever could. His father, Rick Iron Hand Miller, led a small biker crew outside town, men the locals feared, misunderstood, and whispered about behind coffee cups at the diner. Jake had inherited more than his father's last name. He'd inherited his reputation. Most teachers had already decided he was trouble. They'd roll their eyes when his name appeared on their class lists, as if destiny had already been written in permanent ink. But Mrs. Reed didn't believe in destiny. She believed in choices. She watched him carefully during those first weeks of the semester, the way he avoided eye contact, the way his fists clenched whenever someone laughed near him, the way he turned every insult into a shield. The first time she saw him fight, it wasn't out of rebellion. It was out of humiliation. 3 boys had cornered him near the lockers, taunting him about his father, calling him son of a criminal, saying his family was poison. Jake didn't start the fight, but he ended it quickly, and by the time Mrs. Reed arrived, one boy was crying, another had a bloody nose, and Jake stood against the wall, breathing like a trapped animal. The principal suspended him without hesitation. Parents demanded that he be expelled, saying he was dangerous, just like his old man. But Mrs. Reed saw something the others didn't. She saw the look of someone who had been fighting his whole life just to exist. That afternoon, she went to the principal's office and spoke quietly, but firmly. "You can't punish a child for defending himself against hate," she said. "You can discipline his actions, yes, but you don't destroy his future over your fear." The principal, Mr. Thompson, leaned back in his chair and gave her the kind of smile that carried more condescension than words. "Eleanor, this isn't your charity case. He's a lost cause. Save your sympathy for someone who deserves it." She straightened her posture. "Every child deserves it." Those 6 words hung in the air long after she left the room. At home that evening, Eleanor sat at her kitchen table with her lesson plans spread out, but her thoughts stayed on Jake. She couldn't forget the way he'd refused to look her in the eye, or how he'd clenched his jaw to keep from crying when she told him he could still make things right. Maybe it wasn't logic guiding her anymore. Maybe it was instinct or compassion or something deeper. Sometimes the line between reason and empathy blurs when you see someone drowning and realize you're the only one willing to reach in. The next morning, she found Jake sitting outside the school before the bell rang. His knuckles were still bruised, and his backpack looked like it had been through a war. "You shouldn't be here," he muttered, not looking at her. "And yet here we both are," she replied, sitting down beside him. "You want to tell me what happened yesterday?" He shrugged. "What's the point? No one's going to believe me anyway." "I will." He looked at her then, suspicion flickering into something softer, almost confusion. "Why? Everyone says I'm just like him." Eleanor smiled faintly. "Then maybe they need new glasses." That was the first crack in his armor. Small, almost invisible, but it was there. Over the weeks that followed, she started giving him extra assignments, small responsibilities that made him feel trusted. She asked him to help fix broken desks, to read aloud in class, to stay after school to grade papers. Slowly, the boy who once hid behind anger began to participate cautiously, like a stray animal testing the water before drinking. But kindness always attracts scrutiny. Other teachers began to whisper that she was getting too involved. One even accused her of encouraging delinquency. Eleanor ignored them. She'd seen what indifference could do to a child, how it built walls no education could ever break. Then came the parent-teacher conference that nearly cost her career. The mother of one of the boys Jake had fought stormed into the room demanding his expulsion. "He's a menace!" she shouted. "That boy doesn't belong in a school. He belongs behind bars." Eleanor's voice didn't rise, but it carried. "You're not talking about a criminal," she said. "You're talking about a 13-year-old boy who's been hurt more times than he's been helped. Maybe that's the problem. No one ever tried to see the difference." There was a silence so sharp it could cut glass. The principal reprimanded her afterward, told her to know her place. But that night she received a note under her classroom door, written in uneven handwriting. "Thanks for not giving up on me, Jake." It wasn't much, but for her, it was enough. As months turned into years, their dynamic became something rare, a teacher who refused to surrender and a boy learning for the first time that not everyone would walk away. Yet the town didn't forget who he was. When a series of small thefts happened near the school, suspicion fell on Jake. Immediately, there was no evidence, just prejudice disguised as certainty. And once again Mrs. Reed was called into the office, where familiar faces waited for her to agree. "She's blinded by pity," one teacher said. "He's manipulating her." Eleanor stood firm. "If belief in a child is blindness, then I'll gladly never see again." In that moment, she wasn't just defending Jake. She was defending every misunderstood soul who'd ever been labeled before they had a chance to explain themselves. Still, even the strongest faith is tested. One winter afternoon, she found Jake sitting on the steps after school, a detention slip crumpled in his hand. His eyes were red, not from tears, but from holding them back too long. "They're never going to change their minds about me," he said quietly. "No matter what I do." Eleanor knelt beside him. "Then you change your own mind first. Let them be wrong about you, Jake. Don't you dare make them right." That sentence became the seed of transformation. It was more than advice. It was a challenge, a mirror, a spark. From that day he began showing up differently, still rough around the edges, still quick to anger, but there was something new, restraint, effort, the slow rebuilding of a boy who had decided to rewrite his story. What Eleanor didn't know then was how much those words would echo years later in moments she would never witness. Because every act of faith, every defense made in a small office or empty hallway carries an unseen legacy. Some lessons never show their results inside a classroom. They grow quietly on the open road, waiting for the day they return. And that day was coming sooner than anyone in Maple Ridge could have imagined. Word traveled fast in Maple Ridge, especially bad word. It only took one parent's complaint, one teacher's gossip over coffee, for rumors to crawl through the town like weeds finding cracks in concrete. "That Reed woman's lost it," they said. "She's defending a criminal's kid like he's some kind of saint." The whispers followed Eleanor everywhere, from the grocery store aisle to the church pew on Sunday mornings. And though no one said it to her face, she could feel the judgment in every nod that lasted a second too long, every forced smile that came with a raised eyebrow. The school's principal, Mr. Thompson, finally called her into his office. The blinds were half closed, casting sharp lines of light across the room, the kind that made people look smaller than they were. He leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled, tone measured but cold. "Eleanor, you're one of our most experienced teachers. You've got to know where to draw the line." She met his eyes calmly. "The line between what, exactly?" "Between teaching and parenting. You're getting too involved with that boy. It's not your job to fix him." Her reply came without hesitation. "It's my job to make sure no one gives up on him before he's had a chance to grow." He sighed. "You're too soft. The world's not kind to boys like Jake Miller. It's better he learns that now." Eleanor's voice dropped to a whisper. "Maybe that's exactly what's wrong with the world." She left his office knowing she'd just made herself a target, but she didn't care. There's a certain kind of courage that comes from quiet conviction, the kind that doesn't need applause to stand tall. What she didn't know was that outside those school walls, things for Jake were already spiraling. His father, Rick Miller, had been arrested. Again. This time for a bar fight that ended with a broken jaw and a police cruiser smashed against a fence. The news hit Jake like a punch to the gut. When Eleanor found out, she didn't wait for him to come to school. She went to his house instead, a small, rusted trailer parked behind the highway gas station. The front steps were littered with cigarette butts, the windows covered with sheets instead of curtains. She knocked softly, half expecting no one to answer. Then the door opened. And there he was, eyes swollen, face pale, the weight of the world sitting on his shoulders. "Don't," he muttered. "I already know what you're going to say." Eleanor stepped inside anyway. "Then you also know I'm not here to scold you." He looked up, suspicious, like he couldn't tell if it was a trick. "Everyone's saying my dad's trash, that I'll end up the same. Maybe they're right." She shook her head. "Jake, listen to me. You are not your father's mistakes. You have your own road, and every decision you make is another mile away from his." Something in her tone, steady but not pitying, made him freeze. "Why do you even care?" he asked. "I'm just another bad headline waiting to happen." Eleanor smiled sadly. "Because I know that's not true. And deep down, so do you." It wasn't a grand speech. It didn't need to be. It was the kind of truth that lands quietly but stays forever. He didn't reply, but the look in his eyes changed, just slightly, like the first crack of light in a long winter. But the world didn't change with him. The next week, Mrs. Reed walked into the teacher's lounge to find two of her colleagues talking in hushed tones. They didn't realize she was there. "She's making a mistake," one said. "You can't save everyone, especially not someone like him." "She's always been idealistic," the other replied, "but one day that boy's gonna hurt someone, and she'll regret it." Eleanor didn't confront them. She just poured her coffee, stirring slowly, thinking of all the people who confuse caution with wisdom. Sometimes what they call realism is just fear wearing a smarter outfit. Outside school, the pressure mounted too. Parents started requesting that their children be moved to other classes. Some sent letters accusing her of encouraging rebellion. One evening, while she was walking home, a car slowed beside her. Inside were three local men, fathers of her students, men who drank too much courage at the bar before deciding to teach her a lesson. "You think you're some kind of savior," one called out. "That kid's a thug. You'll see where he ends up." The car roared off, leaving her standing alone under the flickering streetlight. She never told anyone about that moment, but it stayed with her. Fear doesn't always shout. Sometimes it lingers quietly in the chest, whispering doubts in the middle of the night. Yet every morning She returned to school like nothing happened. Because the truth is, when you've decided to stand for something, the cost stops mattering. Jake noticed. He wasn't the kind of boy who said thank you out loud, but he watched her carefully. When others mocked her, he'd stare them down until they stopped. When she gave him assignments that seemed impossible, he did them anyway, not to impress her, but to prove her faith wasn't misplaced. And slowly, something began to shift inside him, a mindset that replaced self-destruction with determination. He started to believe not in miracles, but in effort. Still, there were days when anger came back like an old habit, when he'd hear kids whispering about his dad or see his teacher being mocked for defending him. The rage would flare. One afternoon, he cornered a boy behind the bleachers for calling Eleanor the biker's pet. His fists clenched, but before the first punch landed, he stopped. It was as if her voice echoed in his head. "You change your own mind first." He walked away without saying a word. The boy laughed at him for it, but Jake didn't care. For the first time, restraint felt stronger than revenge. Behind the scenes, though, Eleanor's position at the school grew fragile. The board began questioning her judgment, and the principal hinted that if she wanted to avoid complications, she might consider retiring early. But she refused. "I didn't come this far to quit because people are uncomfortable with compassion," she told him. And even though her voice stayed calm, her hands trembled when she left the office. Not from fear, but from exhaustion. Because fighting ignorance day after day takes more than intellect. It takes emotional endurance. It's like holding a candle in a storm, knowing the wind will never stop, but deciding to protect the flame anyway. That was Eleanor's hidden truth. She wasn't strong because she felt no pain. She was strong because she felt everything, and still chose to act with grace. One night, after grading papers long past midnight, she found a folded piece of notebook paper under her classroom door again. "This," one said, "I didn't hit him today. Thought you'd like that." "Jake," she smiled. It wasn't poetry, but it was progress. The next morning, the world tested them again. A police car pulled up to the school, and students whispered before the officers even stepped out. They weren't here for Jake this time. They were here for his father's belongings, to seize what little was left from the latest arrest. Jake sat through class, staring at his desk, pretending not to care. But Eleanor could see the tremor in his hands. When the bell rang, he didn't move. "You ever feel like no matter what you do, life's already decided who you are?" he asked quietly. Eleanor thought for a moment. "Yes," she said. "But life's wrong about people more often than it admits." He looked up, surprised. "You really think I can be different?" "I don't think it, Jake. I know it, but it's not enough for me to know. You have to decide it's true." That conversation marked a turning point neither of them would forget. It wasn't a grand revelation. It was a simple exchange of belief, but belief, once given freely, can become the foundation of transformation. It's the moment when a child realizes someone sees their potential as fact, not fiction. Over time, Jake's anger began to redirect itself. He still wore the same worn-out jacket, still carried the roughness of his world, but there was purpose behind his defiance now. He stood up for smaller kids. He helped Eleanor carry boxes without being asked. He even apologized to teachers, to classmates awkwardly, like someone learning a new language of decency, and people started to notice. Some dismissed it as temporary, others refused to believe it at all. But Eleanor saw it clearly. Redemption doesn't announce itself. It builds quietly in the shadows. She understood that sometimes the greatest transformations happen when no one is watching. Yet she also knew something darker. Society's memory is short when it comes to good deeds, but eternal when it comes to mistakes. And no matter how far Jake went, the shadow of his father's sins still clung to his name, like smoke that wouldn't wash off. Still, she never stopped believing in him, and he never forgot who stood beside him when no one else would. In those silent moments between teacher and student, something invisible was forged, a bond stronger than fear, thicker than blood, a promise unspoken yet unbreakable, waiting quietly in the back of time for its day to return. And somewhere down the road, when the roar of engines filled the sky again, that promise would come roaring back too. It happened on one of those grey mornings when the air felt heavier than usual, like the sky itself was holding its breath. Maple Ridge High was half empty that day because of the storm that had rolled in overnight. Rain drummed softly against the windows, and the hallways were quieter than normal, the kind of quiet that always came before something bad. Eleanor felt it the moment she walked in. Years of teaching had trained her to sense when trouble was about to unfold, and today that feeling clung to her like static. By lunch, whispers had already begun spreading down the corridor. "Jake Miller's done it again," someone muttered. "This time it's bad." She froze mid-step, the stack of papers in her hand trembling slightly. It wasn't the first time Jake had gotten into a fight, but lately he had been calmer, more thoughtful, almost deliberate in his efforts to stay out of trouble. That's why this rumor felt different. It wasn't about a boy acting out, it was about a line being crossed. She found him in the principal's office, sitting in the same chair he'd been in a dozen times before, only now his knuckles were bloodied and his jaw was tight with defiance. Two other boys sat on the opposite side, both with bruised faces and the smug confidence of sons whose fathers donated to the school board. Mr. Thompson stood behind his desk, pacing like a judge rehearsing a sentence. "What happened?" Eleanor asked, her voice steady but low. "He assaulted 2 students," the principal snapped before Jake could speak. "Unprovoked, violent, and unacceptable. I've already called the sheriff's office." "That's not true," Jake shot back. "They were—" He stopped himself mid-sentence, his breath shaking. "They were what, Jake?" Eleanor asked gently. The boys across the room exchanged grins. One of them spoke up, his tone laced with mock innocence. "We were just talking. Didn't know Miss Reed had her own little bodyguard." Eleanor's stomach dropped. She didn't need an explanation, she already knew. "They called you names," Jake muttered finally, eyes fixed on the floor. "Said you only defend me because you feel sorry for me. Said you probably like my dad." His voice cracked on that last part. "I told them to shut up. They didn't." Mr. Thompson folded his arms. "So you decided to teach them a lesson with your fists." Jake didn't answer. He didn't have to. The bruises said enough. "Eleanor," the principal continued, "we've bent every rule for this boy because of you. You've protected him from suspension, vouched for his behavior, even taken heat from the community. But this is the end of the line." Her chest tightened. He was defending someone, not attacking. "Surely you can see the difference." "I see a liability," he replied coldly, "and this school doesn't have room for martyrs or their protégés." There was nothing more to say. Decisions like these weren't about truth. They were about reputation, about keeping the peace for the parents who wrote the checks. Eleanor knew that, but knowing didn't make it hurt less. When the meeting ended, she found Jake waiting by the door with his backpack slung over his shoulder. His expression was blank, but his eyes gave him away. Fury mixing with shame, grief disguised as anger. She reached out, but he stepped back. "You don't have to say it," he muttered. "I know I messed up." She shook her head. "You stood up for someone, Jake. That's not messing up. That's courage." He laughed bitterly. "Yeah? Look where courage got me." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. There were 1,000 things she wanted to say. To remind him that doing the right thing often feels like punishment, that people who fight for what's good usually bleed for it. But the words stayed caught in her throat. "I'll talk to the board," she finally said. "There might still be a way." "There's not," he interrupted softly. "They made up their minds the second they saw my last name." His words cut through her composure like glass, and deep down she knew he was right. Outside, the rain had turned into a steady drizzle, the kind that soaked everything without warning. Jake followed her to the front steps of the school, his boots splashing in shallow puddles. He paused at the bottom, staring at the building he'd spent years trying to survive. "They were wrong about you," he said quietly. Eleanor frowned. "What do you mean? You actually cared." He shifted his weight, avoiding her eyes. "No one else ever did. You're the only one who ever saw good in me, and I won't forget that." She smiled sadly. "You don't owe me anything, Jake." He met her gaze then, steady, unflinching. "That's where you're wrong. I owe you everything, and I'll pay that back one day." Before she could respond, he turned and walked away, his silhouette fading into the mist. She stood there long after he disappeared, her umbrella forgotten at her. Sighed, the rain sliding down her face like tears she refused to show. Something inside her whispered that it was the last time she'd see him, but the heart has its own way of making peace with impossible goodbyes. She went home that night to her small house filled with old books and lesson plans, sitting quietly in the living room where the ticking of the clock felt louder than usual. She tried to read, to distract herself, but every line blurred into thoughts of the boy who had defended her, honor at the cost of his future. In the days that followed, the town's gossip machine went into overdrive. Parents said it was about time he was expelled. Some even suggested it was her fault for putting ideas in his head. She didn't answer them. She didn't defend herself. There's no argument that can change a closed mind. Instead, she focused on her remaining students, though every empty chair in her classroom seemed to echo with his name. Once, while erasing the chalkboard, she caught herself whispering, "You can still change your story, Jake." It wasn't a prayer exactly, but it felt like one. Years passed, as they always do when no one is counting. The seasons in Maple Ridge came and went, and the small town forgot. But Eleanor never did. She kept teaching, kept believing in other lost causes, even when the world gave her fewer reasons to. She didn't know where Jake had gone, whether he'd fallen into his father's world or escaped it. But sometimes, late at night, when a motorcycle roared down the highway outside her window, she found herself holding her breath, wondering if it was him. Some nights, she even imagined him stopping by the porch, taller, older, changed. She pictured him standing in the rain, saying, "I made it, Mrs. Reed." But those were only dreams, quiet echoes of a promise she never expected to be kept. Yet beneath those imagined scenes was a hidden truth, one that only time would reveal, because what Eleanor didn't know was that her small act of belief had planted something far more powerful than memory. It had built the foundation of a man's entire transformation. Jake's departure wasn't the end. It was the beginning of a journey no one saw coming. Behind the scenes, far from Maple Ridge, he was being remade, tested by roads, by wrong turns, by choices that carved their lessons into his skin. He fell, failed, got up again. The boy who once fought out of rage was learning to fight for purpose. There were years when he drifted, years, when the darkness nearly took him whole. But every time he found himself standing at the edge of some nameless mistake, her words returned, steady as a compass. "Let them be wrong about you, Jake. Don't you dare make them right." Those words became his anchor, the line that separated the man he was from, the man he refused to become. And while Eleanor's hair turned grey and her hands began to tremble from time and chalk dust, somewhere miles away, a man in a worn leather jacket carried her belief. Like a badge, he didn't know when he'd see her again, only that someday he would, because promises like the one he made under that storm-grey sky don't fade, they wait. And one day, when the engines roared again through the quiet streets of Maple Ridge, the woman who once taught him what decency meant would finally understand what kind of man she had raised through faith alone. The years had rolled by quietly, the way time often does when no one is watching. Maple Ridge hadn't changed much. Same cracked sidewalks, same diner at the corner of Main Street, same cold wind curling through the alleys in winter. But Eleanor Reed had changed. The woman who once walked into her classroom with bright eyes and a folder full of lesson plans now woke each morning to a silence so heavy it seemed to settle on her shoulders before she even got out of bed. Her husband, Tom, had passed away a few years earlier after a long illness. Their house, the same modest home where they'd shared decades of laughter and small, ordinary moments, now echoed with absence. Every corner held a ghost of memory, a teacup left in the cabinet he used to reach for, a jacket still hanging by the door, as if he might come back to grab it. Her pension barely stretched through the month. The bills piled up faster than her resolve could keep pace. The light in the kitchen flickered with each unpaid statement, and the grocery bags grew lighter every week. Still, Eleanor tried to keep her dignity intact. She taught herself to live smaller, quieter. She made tea instead of dinner, replaced outings with memories, and told herself that peace was just another word for acceptance. One grey afternoon, when the wind was biting at the windows and the sky had that familiar heaviness of approaching rain, a sharp knock echoed through the house. She opened the door to find a man in a grey suit holding a clipboard. His expression was polite but rehearsed, the kind that told you he'd done this too many times before. "Mrs. Reed?" "Yes," she answered, though her voice was barely a whisper. "I'm with the county bank. I'm afraid I need to deliver this in person." He handed her a sealed envelope, heavy with finality. The official stamp glared at her like an accusation. She didn't need to open it to know what it was. Still, she unfolded the paper with trembling fingers. Her eyes scanned the words slowly, each one cutting deeper than the last. Foreclosure notice, payment delinquent, property to be vacated. Within 30 days. For a moment she stood there in silence, the only sound the soft hum of the refrigerator behind her. The man cleared his throat, his tone almost apologetic. "I'm sorry, ma'am. I truly am. I know this must be difficult." She nodded, unable to find words. "It's all right," she said quietly, though it wasn't. "You're just doing your job." After he left, she closed the door gently and leaned against it, the paper still in her hand. The house seemed to sigh with her, every creak and groan echoing the sound of something breaking. She walked through each room slowly that evening, running her fingers over the surfaces she had once dusted with care. The mantel where her husband's photos stood, the kitchen counter where she had corrected hundreds of essays, the old oak table covered in scratches from years of grading papers and scribbling lesson plans. It was more than just a house. It was the vessel of a lifetime, a museum of the woman she had been. Every wall held laughter and struggle, transformation and faith, and now it would belong to no one. As night fell, Eleanor sat in the living room with a cup of tea growing cold in her hands. Her mind drifted backward to the sound of chalk against a board, the murmur of students, the face of a boy who once promised to pay back her belief in him. She had taught thousands of students over the years, each one a brief flicker in her story. But Jake Miller's face never left her memory. She often wondered what had become of him. Some nights she imagined he'd turned his life around, maybe even started a family somewhere far from Maple Ridge. Other nights, darker ones, she feared he'd followed his father's path, swallowed by a world that never forgave him. She whispered to the empty room, "I hope you made it, Jake." Her voice cracked softly, carried away by the ticking clock. Days turned into weeks. Eleanor began packing her belongings into old cardboard boxes she'd saved in the basement. It wasn't just about organizing her things. It was about sorting her life into what could fit in the back of a borrowed pickup truck. Each object she touched seemed to carry its own small revelation. The coffee mug with a chipped rim that Jake had once given her, back when he was still in middle school, shyly mumbling something about "thanks for the help." A faded photograph of her first class, where 20 children smiled with the kind of innocence only time can steal. A stack of essays tied with string, their pages yellowed but still filled with dreams, written in young handwriting. She held one paper closer, remembering the boy who had written it. "When I grow up, I want to be someone people can count on." The name at the top, Jake Miller. Her throat tightened. The irony wasn't lost on her. She had spent her life teaching others to build futures, only to find herself at the end of her own, with no safety net to catch her. But beneath the sadness, there was still a quiet dignity, the same unshakable moral backbone that had once led her to stand up to parents and principals was still there, fragile but alive. Some nights she sat by the window and watched the headlights passing on the highway. Each one carried a story, a stranger heading somewhere, maybe home, maybe away from it. And sometimes when the wind shifted, she thought she heard the faint growl of motorcycles in the distance, fading as quickly as they came. It was probably just her imagination, but the sound made her heart beat faster, as if something old was stirring. Her neighbors tried to help in small ways. Mrs. Patterson from across the street brought soup. The mailman offered to carry her boxes. But pity, even when sincere, felt like salt in the wound. Eleanor had built her life on giving strength to others. It was hard now to accept it in return. She smiled, thanked them, and kept her struggle mostly private. That was her nature. On the morning she received the final notice, a thin layer of frost covered the front porch. She stepped outside to take one last look at her yard, wrapped in an old cardigan and clutching her cup of coffee for warmth. The air smelled of winter and endings. A few leaves, brittle and tired, skittered across the cracked path. She could almost see Tom standing beside her, hands in his pockets, teasing her about her stubbornness. "You'd stay and fight the wind itself if you could," he used to say. She smiled faintly at the memory. "Maybe I would," she whispered. Inside, she returned to her half-packed boxes. Every motion was deliberate, a ritual of letting go. The sound of tape tearing echoed through the quiet house. The clock ticked steadily, unbothered by her sorrow. The world, as always, moved on. Yet beneath all that routine, something deeper stirred, a hidden truth she couldn't quite name. Maybe it was regret, or maybe it was the faint pulse of hope refusing to die. She found herself glancing toward the front window more often these days, as if expecting someone. She didn't know who or why, only that a strange anticipation had settled in her chest like static before a storm. Late one afternoon, as the sun began to sink behind the hills, she sat down on the floor surrounded by boxes. The dust caught the light like tiny fragments of memory floating in the air. She looked around the room that had once been filled with laughter, lesson plans, and the clatter of her husband's old typewriter. Now it was just her, and the ticking of the clock, and the faint hum of an old refrigerator trying to outlive its usefulness. She picked up one last photograph, a younger version of herself, standing in front of her classroom, smiling beside a group of children. Her hair was dark then, her posture straight, her eyes full of certainty. It almost hurt to look at that version of herself, the one who still believed that doing good was enough to protect you from pain. "I wish I could tell her how it turns out," she murmured to herself, "that she was right about the good part, just wrong about the protection." Outside, the wind began to rise again, carrying the first hint of rain. A storm was coming. The kind that rattles windows and reminds you how small you are against the world. Eleanor closed her eyes and let the sound wash over her. There was something strangely comforting about it, like the rhythm of an old friend returning. She didn't know that miles away, the same storm was gathering above a line of engines cutting through the highway. Headlights glowed through. The drizzle, their reflections stretching across the wet asphalt. Among them, a man with grey in his beard and a leather jacket worn by time rode at the front, his eyes steady, his thoughts locked on a promise made long ago. But for now, in that quiet little house at the edge of Maple Ridge, Eleanor Reed sat surrounded by the remnants of her past, unaware that her kindness, once dismissed, once mocked, was on its way back to her, in the form of thunder. And somewhere between the fading light and the first rumble in the distance, the story that had begun with belief was preparing to return in full force. The rain hadn't stopped for 3 days straight, the kind of slow, steady downpour that turned the world grey and reflective. Out on Highway 67, somewhere between nowhere and the edge of a half-forgotten town, stood a weathered biker bar called the Rusted Halo. The neon sign outside flickered like a dying heartbeat, and the smell of oil, beer, and wet leather hung thick in the air. Inside, the murmur of conversation blended with the soft crackle of an old jukebox, playing a song that no one was really listening to. Men with faces carved by years of wind and consequence sat around scarred tables. Tattoos told stories their mouths never would. Brotherhood, regret, redemption. Women leaned at the bar, sipping slowly, half listening to the laughter that never reached anyone's eyes. It wasn't a place where hope lived. It was a place where people came to forget how much they missed it. At a corner table, half hidden in shadow, sat Hawk, though years ago his name had been Jake Miller. He was broader now, his hair threaded with grey, a scar cutting down the side of his cheek like punctuation at the end of a violent sentence. His leather jacket bore the patch of Iron King's MC, the brotherhood he had built from the ashes of his old life. Around him sat men who'd been through everything: addiction, prison, war, betrayal. Men who followed him not because he was loud, but because he was steady. His presence had a gravity to it, quiet but unshakable. The TV above the bar played the local news, its sound barely audible over the hum of voices, but the words Maple Ridge and eviction notice cut through the noise like a blade. The bartender turned it up. Local retiree and former teacher Eleanor Reed is being forced to vacate her home after a recent foreclosure. No one noticed the way Hawk's hand froze mid-air, his glass halfway to his lips. The image flashed briefly. An old woman standing on a porch, holding a notice against her chest as the wind tugged at her hair. His jaw tightened. "Hey, boss," one of the younger riders said. "Ain't that your old town?" Hawk didn't answer at first. His mind had already drifted backward, through decades of asphalt and noise, to a quiet classroom with sunlight spilling across the floor. He could still see her there, her steady eyes, her calm defiance, the way she'd told him, "You're not your father's mistakes." The kind of words that stick to a man's soul like scripture, even when everything else fades. Another voice chimed in, this one older, rougher. "You knew her?" Hawk set his drink down slowly, the glass hitting the wood with a low, deliberate thud. "She was my teacher," he said finally. "She saved my life before I even knew it needed saving." The room went quiet. Respect in places like this wasn't given easily, but everyone knew the tone of a man speaking truth. The bartender, a woman in her 50s, with silver hair pulled back into a braid, nodded softly. "I heard about her," she said. "That's the one who stood up for that kid they called Trouble, right? The whole town turned against her, but she didn't back down. That was you, wasn't it?" Hawk didn't answer. He didn't need to. The silence said enough. Someone at the back of the bar chuckled, not mockingly, but with disbelief. She must have been something, for a teacher to go to bat for a biker's kid. "She wasn't just a teacher," Hawk said quietly. "She was the first person who ever looked me in the eye and saw a man instead of a mistake. I owe her everything." He leaned back in his chair, the weight of memory pressing against him. For years he'd built his life around motion. One ride after another, one cause after the next. But in that moment, stillness hit him harder than any road ever had. "She's gonna lose her house," the bartender said softly, watching the screen. "After all she did for those kids." Something shifted. In Hawk's face, a flicker of emotion that was rare for a man who had long learned to hide it. "Not while I'm breathing," he said. His voice was low, but certain, a command wrapped in conviction. The room stilled. Every head turned toward him. One of the men, a tall, broad-shouldered rider named Mason, leaned forward. "What are you thinking, brother?" Hawk stood, pulling on his gloves with deliberate calm. "I'm thinking no one leaves that woman out in the cold. Not her, not after what she did." There was a murmur of agreement around the room, but he wasn't finished. "She gave me a future," he said. "Now it's our turn to give her one back." For a moment, no one moved. Then the first engine started outside, a sharp growl that broke through the rain. Another followed, and another. One by one the sound grew, until it wasn't just noise. It was an anthem, a promise in motion. The bartender smiled faintly, wiping the counter with a rag. "Guess Maple Ridge is about to see something it's never seen before." As Hawk walked toward the door, Mason called out, "You sure she's still there, after all these years?" Hawk paused at the threshold, rain dripping from the brim of his helmet. "She's there," he said. "She's always been there." He stepped into the storm without looking back. The men followed, leather jackets glistening with rain, headlights slicing through the darkness. The ground vibrated under the weight of engines, a symphony of loyalty and redemption roaring to life. The bar lights flickered as they pulled away, the windows shaking from the sound. Inside, the jukebox clicked to a stop mid-song, leaving behind an eerie silence that seemed sacred. The bartender stood alone now, her hands resting on the edge of the counter, eyes glistening. She'd seen her share of violence in that place, of men trying to bury their pasts in alcohol and adrenaline. But what she had just witnessed wasn't about revenge or pride. It was about gratitude. Outside, the rain came harder. Hawk's bike cut through it like a blade, his mind a storm of memories. He remembered the look on Eleanor's face when she defended him to the principal, the tremor in her voice when she said every child deserves a chance. He had carried those words for decades, though he'd never spoken them aloud. Now he spoke them to the rain itself. "You were right, Mrs. Reed. They were wrong about me, about us." His voice was swallowed by the wind, but it didn't matter. Every mile they rode was an answer to a prayer she didn't even know she'd made. Behind him, the line of bikers stretched like a river of chrome and thunder, headlights glowing through the mist like guardian spirits. This wasn't just a ride. It was a pilgrimage, a journey back to the place where his story had begun. And in that journey lay something deeper, the revelation that even in a world built on noise and chaos, there were still debts of the heart that demanded to be paid. As the miles disappeared beneath their tires, the storm grew louder, almost as if the heavens themselves wanted to bear witness. Hawk tightened his grip on the handlebars, eyes locked on the horizon. Somewhere ahead, beyond the rain and years, waited the woman who had once refused to stop believing in him. He didn't know what he'd say when he saw her again. Maybe words wouldn't even be enough. But that didn't matter. What mattered was the decision, the mindset that defined every man who had ever found redemption on two wheels. You can't repay the past with apologies. You repay it with action. And that night, in the middle of a storm that smelled like gasoline and fate, a brotherhood of outlaws rode not for vengeance, but for love, the rarest kind there is. By the time they reached the outskirts of Maple Ridge, dawn was beginning to break. The rain had softened to a mist, the kind that turned the morning light silver. The engines quieted as they approached the town's narrow streets, passing the old diner, the school, the gas station. That hadn't changed since the 90s. Hawk slowed his bike as the familiar road came into view, the one that led to a small, aging house with white paint peeling from the shutters. And somewhere inside that house, a woman sat with her boxes packed, unaware that the sound building in the distance wasn't thunder this time. It was something else, something she had unknowingly created decades ago. The rumble of redemption was on its way home. Rain returned the way old grief does, quiet at first, then certain. It tracked across the window panes in long silver threads, while Eleanor sealed another box with the last strip of tape. The house felt thinner with each item she packed, as if every book and photograph removed a layer of insulation from her memories. She paused, palms pressed to the cardboard, and listened. At first she thought it was thunder rolling across the hills again, that same low tremor that had followed her all week. But there was a rhythm beneath it, a pulse with intention. The sound swelled, then multiplied, and the glass hummed with the vibration. Not thunder, engines, 1, 2, 10, dozens, and then more, until the road outside her small front yard became a river of motion. Her breath caught. She moved to the window, fingertips parting the curtain. Headlights condensed out of the rain, halos in the mist, forming a slow-moving constellation that turned her street into a runway of light. Black leather jackets, wet with the storm, gleamed like armor. Visors lifted, gloves tightened. Boots touched down in a measured cadence, as if every step had been practiced in secret. Neighbors' porches flickered to life, faces appearing behind cracked doors, a chorus of disbelief spreading house to house. Eleanor didn't move at first. It felt like a dream misfiled into reality, a behind-the-scenes montage from someone else's movie. She watched the line of motorcycles ease to a collective halt, the engines idling in a low growl that vibrated through the floorboards. The sound had weight, but not the kind that threatened. This was a gathering with a purpose, a decision made long ago finally arriving at her door. She could sense it, the way a teacher senses which child in a room is quietly carrying the heaviest load. A man stepped forward, removing his helmet with unhurried care. Rain beaded on the worn leather of his jacket and ran through the grey in his beard. The camera, if there had been one, would have lingered where Eleanor's eyes did, on the unmistakable. Recognition that travelled across 20 years and landed gently in the space between them. It was the same gaze she once met in a cramped office, the same boy who had learned to build a shield out of silence. His voice carried easily over the soft percussion of rain. "Told you I'd pay it back, ma'am." Her hand fell from the curtain. For a second, she couldn't make her legs obey. Then she found the doorknob and opened the house to the storm, stepping onto the porch where the air smelled like wet, earth and gasoline and something older, like a promise that refused to be forgotten. Up close, the years on his face only deepened what she recognized. The mindset of a man who had made hard decisions and paid for them. The hidden truth of a journey that had changed shape but never lost direction. "Jake," she said, and the name was both a memory and a revelation. He nodded once. "It's Hawk now," he added, almost apologetic. "But I kept the other name where it matters." She didn't ask where that was. She already knew. Behind him, the street had become a sea of headlights. Men and women stood beside their bikes, expressions open, not defiant. Some carried the years in their tattoos. Others wore them in the set of their shoulders. The impact of their presence landed without fanfare. It wasn't spectacle, it was testimony. "I saw your house on the news," Hawk said, voice steady. "I should have come sooner." "You came," she answered, and that was all the data the moment required. Rain gathered on the porch roof and dropped in a steady line onto the cracked steps. Hawk glanced at the boxes stacked in the foyer, then back at her. "They gave you a date." 10 days, she said. "Maybe less." His jaw tightened. "Not anymore." Something unspooled in her chest, relief mixed with the old reflex to refuse help. She had taught thousands to stand upright. Taking a hand felt like breaking a rule she'd written for herself, back when strength meant self-sufficiency. But she read the room the way she had always read rooms, people first, pride second. The rain blurred her hesitation into something softer. "Come in out of the weather," she said, voice careful. "You'll all get soaked." "We're soaked already," Hawk replied, a hint of humor warming the words. "But if you don't mind, I'd like to see the place again, the classroom you carried home." She stepped aside, and he crossed the threshold with quiet reverence. The others stayed respectfully near the curb, engines idling like distant thunder, while a few peeled off to line the block and manage traffic. The neighbors watched as if a parade had passed into scripture, Mrs. Patterson with her hands clasped, the mailman halfway down the sidewalk holding a bundle of letters no one would read until later. Inside, the living room felt smaller than Hawk remembered, but that might have been the gravity of return making the walls lean in. His eyes took inventory the way a man measures the distance between who he was and who he became. The oak table with its constellation of grading scratches, the bookshelf with spines furred by dust, the photograph of a younger Eleanor surrounded by bright faces. He reached toward the frame, stopped, and let his hand drop to his side. "I used to sit right there," he said, nodding at the end of the table. "After school. You made me read out loud until the words stopped fighting me." "You stopped fighting them," she corrected gently. Hawk smiled. Rare, honest, brief. "I learned there are some fights you win by changing the rules." He turned, noticing a chipped mug on the mantel. The old glaze bore the outline of a faded blue star. The same cheap gift a boy once purchased with crumpled dollars because gratitude needed a container, and that was all he could afford. "You kept it," he said. "Of course," she answered. Some things aren't worth much until you remember why you have them. Outside, the engine shifted tone in a slow wave, a collective breath moving through chrome and steel. The sound was oddly comforting, like a heartbeat amplified. Rain tilted harder against the windows and then eased, as if the storm itself wanted to watch. Hawk glanced back toward the door, then lowered his voice. "I didn't always make the right decisions," he admitted. "There were years when I thought the road would chew me up the way it did my father. But every time I got close to breaking, I'd hear you say it. Let them be wrong about you. Don't make them right." Eleanor swallowed. "You made it yours. I made it ours," he said simply. "That's the hidden truth no one tells you. None of us climbs out alone." The porch creaked. Mason appeared in the doorway, rain dripping from his jacket. "Boss," he said, nodding respectfully toward Eleanor. "We did a sweep. Town's tight, but the street will hold. We can stage here." "Good," Hawk replied, then glanced at Eleanor with a question in his eyes, a request for permission, not authority. "Staging what?" she asked, not fearful, just curious. "Something we've been building for a while," Hawk said. "A kind of correction, not revenge, balance." He hesitated, then added, "Behind-the-scenes work. People you helped didn't forget. Some of them are us, some aren't, but they're ready." He stepped closer, meeting her gaze with the calm of a man who had become fluent in restraint. "No one leaves you out in the cold, not after the way you stood when the wind was at its worst." The rain softened to a delicate patter. From the street came the eloquent language of preparation, kickstands lifting in sequence, tools clinking, quiet voices exchanging logistics. The Brotherhood moved like an orchestra, tuning to a key they all understood. Raise the tent, call the contractor, coordinate with the pro bono lawyer who owed Hawk 3 favors and a life. Speak to the bank, speak to the city, speak to the people who had once called her too soft and would now have to look their own reflection in the eye. It was more than muscle. It was a network, built by years of hard-won trust, a design for impact that didn't make headlines because it didn't need to. Hawk returned to the threshold and looked out at the sea of headlights. "You remember what I said the day I left?" "I remember," she answered, and the memory brightened the room, somehow warming it. "I wasn't ready then," he continued. "I'm ready now." A neighbor cleared his throat from the walkway. It was Mr. Geller from 2 houses down, the same man who had once complained that Eleanor let her grass grow too long when Tom got sick. His cap was soggy and his eyes unsure. "Ma'am," he said to her, "do you need us to move cars or bring coffee or something?" Eleanor stared for a second, surprised by the humility in his voice. "Coffee would be nice," she said softly. "Thank you." He nodded and hurried away, relieved to be useful in history's making. Hawk stepped back onto the porch. The rain painted his jacket in a glossy sheen. He raised his chin, and the line of riders read it, as easily as a spoken command. Engines quieted one by one, until the silence was full enough to hear the rain ticking on metal. He spoke low, but the authority braided through his tone carried, "This is a home. Treat it like one." He turned to Eleanor again. "If anything feels like too much, you tell me. We move at your pace." She smiled, a small, astonished smile that reached the corners of her eyes. "I spent 30 years telling people how to line up and take turns. I think I can handle this." He laughed, another short, clean sound that folded time. "Yes, ma'am." Movement surged organically. Tarp sprung open to shield the porch from the rain. 2 riders set to work, patching the loose gutter that had rattled all autumn, a woman with a long braid and gentle hands. Amber, by the way the others deferred, took inventory of the boxes and made notes in a weatherproof notebook. "We'll catalogue everything," she told Eleanor. "Nothing gets lost. What goes stays by choice, not by pressure." A younger rider jogged up, breath visible in the damp chill. "Hawk, we reached the attorney. He's on his way with a packet. Says there's leverage the bank ignored. Also got the church to open the hall if we need staging." "Good," Hawk said. "Tell him to park behind the school, cut through on Birch. Less traffic." "Yes, sir." The choreography was careful, born of a mindset that had learned to turn chaos into function. Eleanor watched, eyes shining, as men who might have been mistaken for trouble in another context carried her boxes as if they were moving a fragile museum exhibit. "Be careful with that one," Hawk said, pointing to the oak table. "That's where I learned how to change direction." "You learned how to read," Eleanor teased gently. "Same thing," he said, and no one in earshot disagreed. The storm tapered to a fine mist, the kind that leaves everything touched and reflective. In that softened light, the house looked different, less abandoned by fortune, more held by community. And, though the practical work had only just begun, the atmosphere had already shifted. The unspoken verdict of the town, too soft, raising an outlaw, was dissolving under the weight of evidence that required no defense. Hawk stood beside Eleanor in the doorway, shoulders parallel, watching the street become a field of purpose. "You taught me that people are more than their first draft," he said. "I spent a lot of years editing." She exhaled, a whole decade leaving her lungs. "I always hoped you would. I always knew I had to." From down the block came the muted wail of a siren cutting off before it reached their corner. Someone had already made a phone call that turned confrontation into coordination. A city truck rolled by slowly and then kept going. The town, which had once chosen judgment over understanding, seemed to pause and reconsider its own narrative. That was the quiet transformation no one televises. The moment a place decides to grow up. Hawk rested his helmet on the porch. Rail, water dripped from the visor in slow, patient beads. "We'll need to make a few decisions," he said. "Some will be fast, some will take time, but there's a path. I can see it." "Show me," she said. He nodded. "I will." Another wave of riders arrived then, engines announcing them before faces did, and the sea of headlights thickened until the street looked like a runway built for a different kind of takeoff. The neighbors had stopped whispering and started working. Extension cords snaked. From porches, casseroles appeared as if summoned by muscle memory. Someone set a thermos of coffee on the steps with paper cups stacked beside it. The story had shifted from rumor to revelation, not because anyone argued, but because they showed up. Hawk lifted his gaze to the sky, where the clouds were finally thinning in pale seams. He drew a breath that tasted like rain and relief. "All right," he said, voice low and certain, as if giving the next cue in a symphony already in motion. "Let's begin." And just like that, the house at the edge of Maple Ridge, once a place of endings, became the center point of a new geometry, lines of effort converging with the precision of people who understood loyalty as action. The engines idled in a patient hum, the kind that promises more, and the porch light burned steady against the late morning grey, as if it had been waiting for this configuration of faces all along. The morning after their arrival, the storm had softened into a gentle drizzle, the kind that leaves everything glistening like new. The air smelled of wet soil and redemption. The hum of engines still lingered faintly in the distance, but now it mixed with the rhythmic sound of hammers striking wood, voices calling out instructions, and laughter, deep, unguarded laughter, echoing across the small neighborhood that had, for so long, been silent. What had begun as a single act of gratitude had turned into a full-scale restoration. Eleanor stood on her porch, hands wrapped, around a steaming cup of coffee, watching a scene she couldn't have imagined even in her wildest, most forgiving dreams. Hawk's men, or as she'd come to think of them, her unlikely army, were scattered across the yard and roof, working with a precision that came not from training, but from purpose. One group was re-shingling the roof, moving with coordinated rhythm despite the slick boards beneath them. Another was repairing the fence that had leaned tiredly for years, its wood swollen and split. The rest unloaded tools, lumber and boxes from trucks lined down the street. The neighbors had come out too, cautiously at first, peering from behind curtains, then one by one crossing the street with offers of food, umbrellas, extension cords, even hands. The old woman watched it unfold like someone witnessing a hidden truth made visible. That compassion, when it finally decides to act, is louder than judgment ever was. Mason was the first to notice her standing there. "Morning." "Ma'am," he called, tipping his head respectfully. "We're about halfway through the fence. Should have it straight by noon." "You're doing more than I ever could have asked for," she said, her voice warm but still tinged with disbelief. "I don't even know how to thank you." From across the yard, Hawk's deep voice carried over the sound of tools. "You already did," he said simply, tightening the strap on a tarp before turning toward her. His jacket, dark and rain-soaked, looked heavy, but he moved, with the quiet steadiness of someone who'd spent a lifetime earning calm through chaos. Eleanor smiled faintly. "I taught lessons in books, Jake, not in carpentry." He grinned. "Maybe, but you built people. We just fix things." There was a truth in that she couldn't ignore. For all the noise and leather and tattoos, these men and women worked with a care that rivaled any craftsman. They spoke to one another in short phrases, no shouting, no arguing. Every decision was coordinated. And though their presence was striking, even intimidating to some, the longer they stayed, the more they transformed from outlaws into protectors, symbols of something larger than their past. Eleanor's neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, approached shyly with a tray of sandwiches. "I've never seen anything like this," she whispered. "They're kind." Eleanor chuckled softly. "Yes, they always were. The world just took a while to notice." By midday, the house looked different. The broken shingles that had let the rain creep through the attic were gone, replaced by new ones that gleamed slick under the drizzle. The sagging gutter had been reattached. The cracked fence that once made her yard look tired now stood tall again, fresh and solid. She could feel the transformation happening not just around her but inside her, a subtle shift, a healing of something she hadn't realized was still wounded. When Hawk finally walked up to the porch, wiping rain from his face, his boots left wet prints on the old boards. In his hand, he carried a thick envelope sealed in plain brown paper. He didn't hand it to her immediately. He just looked at her with that same quiet determination she'd once seen in a boy sitting outside her classroom, refusing to cry. "I brought something," he said. She frowned slightly, confused. "Jake, you've already brought more than enough." He shook his head. "No, Ma'am. This isn't from me alone. It's from all of us. The brothers, their families, a few friends in town, people you've never met, people who heard what you did and wanted to be part of it." He extended the envelope, and she hesitated before taking it. The weight of it felt symbolic, almost too much. Her fingers trembled slightly as she opened it, revealing a stack of documents and checks. The top page bore the bank's letterhead, stamped "Paid in full." Her breath caught. "Jake, this is my mortgage." "It was," he said. "Not anymore." She stared at him, speechless. How did you even—" He shrugged, lightly. "Let's just say a few of us know people in low places who do good work, and a few in high places who owed us favors." Eleanor's eyes filled, but the tears didn't fall. Instead, she just looked at him the way she used to when he handed in an essay he thought wasn't good enough, with pride and disbelief at how much heart a single person could carry. "I don't know what to say," she whispered. "You already said it," Hawk replied, his voice low and steady. 20 years ago, when you told a broken kid that the world's opinion didn't have to be his reflection, you saved my life before I knew what to do with it." She shook her head slowly, tears finally slipping free. "Jake, I didn't save you. You did that yourself." "Maybe," he said, eyes glinting. "But I wouldn't have tried if you hadn't believed first." He glanced over his shoulder toward the street, where his crew was still at work, tightening bolts, sanding wood, cleaning up debris. The sound of their laughter and engines mingled with the steady rhythm of the rain, creating something that felt almost musical. "Every man you see here," he continued, "was saved because you saved me. You gave me the mindset to fight different battles. I found men who needed the same chance you gave me, and I gave it to them. You didn't just teach a kid, you started a chain reaction." Eleanor covered her mouth, overwhelmed. "All this from one student," he smiled gently, "from one teacher." The moment hung between them, rich with quiet meaning. It wasn't cinematic or exaggerated, just two people standing in the aftermath of decades, seeing the full circle of choices that once seemed small. The rain had slowed to a mist, and a thin beam of sunlight slipped through the clouds, catching the wet metal of the motorcycles and turning them to silver. From the corner of the yard, a young rider shouted, "Roof's sealed, boss. Gutters fixed too." Hawk raised a hand in acknowledgement. "Good work, brother." Then he turned back to her. "You see, they like being useful." Eleanor laughed softly. "They're extraordinary. They just needed someone to remind them they could be," he said. In that instant, the past and present seemed to meet without friction. The boy who once fought to be seen had become the man who led others toward their own redemption, and the woman who once defied a town's judgment had lived long enough to witness her defiance turn into proof, living, roaring, undeniable proof that compassion outlasts condemnation. As the work wound down for the day, the bikers began packing their tools, covering their bikes, and checking the fence one last time. Some of the neighbors came forward to thank them, shy at first, then warmly. Kids who had been watching from windows now ran across the wet grass to touch the gleaming chrome of the motorcycles, their eyes wide with wonder. The riders laughed, patient and kind, showing them how the gears worked, letting them press the horns. Eleanor stood beside Hawk, watching it all unfold. The unlikely unity of a town that had once drawn lines between us and them. There was no line anymore, only people. "You know," she said softly, "when I was younger, I used to think justice was about rules, about right and wrong written in stone. But now I think it's about hearts that choose to do what's right, even when no one asks them to." Hawk nodded. "Justice with a pulse," he said. "That's the kind that lasts." They stood in silence for a while, watching. As the last few clouds drifted apart and the light turned golden, somewhere in the distance, thunder rumbled again, not threatening this time, just reminding them that storms, too, could be cleansing. And as the sound rolled over the horizon, Hawk reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small keychain, a tiny metal star, old and tarnished, the kind a boy might have bought decades ago at a gas station gift rack. "Found this in my jacket a few months back," he said. "Guess I kept it all." This time, without realizing, he placed it gently in her palm. "It reminded me that belief doesn't rust. It just waits for you to notice it again." Eleanor looked down at the star resting in her hand, her reflection faintly mirrored on its surface. She smiled through tears, whispering, "You always did have a way of turning trouble into truth." Hawk chuckled, rubbing the back of his neck. "You gave me the blueprint." The sun broke fully through then, painting the street in soft amber light. For the first time in years, Eleanor's house looked alive again, the colors brighter, the air lighter. The fence stood straight, the roof gleamed, the neighbors lingered. The bikers, once outcast in the eyes of the town, stood laughing with children and shaking hands with men who once crossed the street to avoid them. It wasn't just a house being repaired, it was history being rewritten in real time, a revelation of how far one act of belief can travel, how many lives it can touch, how much light it can resurrect. Eleanor turned to Hawk, her voice trembling with gratitude. "You've given me back more than my home." He looked at her, eyes soft but unwavering. "You gave me my compass. I'm just following it back where it started." And as the wind shifted, carrying the scent of rain and new beginnings, the hum of engines rose once more, not as noise, but as music. A symphony of redemption rolling softly through Maple Ridge, setting the stage for what was still to come. By the next morning, the town of Maple Ridge had already changed, though no one said it aloud. Word spread fast, faster than the rain that had carried the night before. At the diner, people stopped mid-sentence to whisper about what they'd seen. At the grocery store, strangers stood by the magazines, recounting the image that had burned itself into their minds. The house at the end of Birch Street lit up under dawn, surrounded by a sea of motorcycles glinting like armor. No one could quite describe it without their voice softening. It wasn't chaos, it wasn't noise, it was order, purpose, gratitude turned physical. Even those who had once scoffed at Eleanor Reed found themselves quiet when her name came up. For decades, she'd been that soft-hearted teacher, or the woman who couldn't say no to a lost cause. Now she was something else entirely. Proof that compassion could echo back through time and arrive when you least expected it. There was an unspoken recognition spreading through town like a revelation. The hidden truth they had ignored for years was finally standing in front of them. That afternoon, as the clouds began to break and sunlight poured across the freshly mended fences and repaired rooftops, a small crowd gathered outside Eleanor's home. They came slowly at first, neighbors who had peeked from behind curtains, now walking with hesitant steps. The local postman, who delivered years of utility bills and notices, now holding a bouquet of store-bought flowers. A group of children on bicycles, eyes wide, drawn by the lingering sound of the engines. The bikers were still there, lined up in a semicircle along the street, polishing chrome and tightening straps. They didn't speak much, but they didn't need to. Their presence said everything. These were men and women who had learned life's lessons the hard way, who carried stories in their scars. And today, those same hands that once fought to survive were busy helping an old teacher carry her furniture back inside. The scene looked surreal. Leather jackets beside white picket fences, boots splashing through puddles, while neighbors held boxes steady. Eleanor stood on her porch, the sun framing her silver hair, watching as her yard filled with people she'd known her entire life. Some who had once turned away, others who had never spoken more than a polite hello. Her heart felt heavier and lighter at the same time. The contradiction was beautiful, almost too much to hold. One of the town's reporters arrived. With a small camera and notebook, she approached hesitantly, wiping rain from her glasses. "Mrs. Reed, could you tell us what happened here? People are calling it the miracle on Birch Street." Eleanor smiled gently, her eyes drifting toward the rows of motorcycles gleaming in the sun. "Miracle? No," she said softly. "It's just what happens when kindness takes the long road home." The reporter blinked, unsure how to respond, and lowered her notebook slightly. "They say these men, the bikers, they're part of the Iron Kings Club, that they came from all over the state to help you." "That's right," Eleanor replied. "And to think, years ago, people said they'd never amount to anything good. Funny how people forget that broken things can still shine." At the edge of the crowd, Hawk, Jake, stood quietly with his arms crossed, watching her. He wasn't the center of attention, though he easily could have been. Instead, he let the moment belong to her. The others in his brotherhood followed. His lead, standing still, reverent. It wasn't about them anymore. It was about the woman who had started everything. When a small boy, maybe 8 years old, tugged on Eleanor's sleeve, she bent down with a patient smile. "Miss Reed," he asked shyly, "is he the kid you helped a long time ago?" He pointed toward Hawk. She followed his finger and nodded slowly. He was one of them. And now look at him. The boy's eyes widened. "He looks like one of those heroes from the movies." Eleanor chuckled softly. "Sometimes heroes don't wear capes, sweetheart. Sometimes they wear leather and carry lessons instead of weapons." Behind her, a few of the older neighbors exchanged glances, the kind of wordless agreement that comes only when people finally realize how wrong they'd been. Mrs. Patterson, who'd once accused Eleanor of being too trusting, stepped forward with a trembling smile. "I judged you," she said quietly, "and I judged him too. I think maybe I forgot what grace looks like." Eleanor reached out, squeezing her hand. "We all forget now and then. What matters is remembering before it's too late." There was something sacred in that exchange, small, human, transformative, a moment of mindset shifting in real time. Around them, the bikers began to gather in formation, their engines idled low, rumbling like distant thunder. The children clapped their hands over their ears, half afraid, half thrilled by the sound. Hawk put on his helmet, then took it back off. almost as if some part of him couldn't bear to close the distance between himself and the teacher who had once stood alone against an entire town for his sake. He walked up to her, the pavement glistening beneath his boots. "We'll head out soon," he said quietly. "Didn't want to crowd you too long." She shook her head, smiling through tears. "You couldn't crowd me if you tried. This," she gestured toward the bikes, the neighbors, the fixed fence glowing in the light. "This is something I didn't and know I'd ever see again. People coming together without asking what they get in return." "That's your lesson, Mom," he said. "We just learned it slow." A ripple of emotion moved through the crowd. The neighbors, who had spent years defining people by rumors, now stood shoulder to shoulder with the very men they'd once warned their children about. There were no speeches, no apologies shouted across the air, just the quiet understanding that something had shifted permanently. As Hawk turned back toward his crew, Eleanor called out to him, "Jake!" He stopped mid-step and looked back. She smiled, her eyes glistening. "You kept your promise." He nodded once, the simplest acknowledgement, but it carried more weight than words ever could. "You kept the light on," he replied. Then, almost instinctively, the riders began to form a line. Their engines roared to life one by one, the sound growing until it filled the street, vibrating through the pavement and into the hearts of everyone. Watching. It wasn't loud in the usual way. It was powerful, almost ceremonial. The children covered their ears again, but they were smiling now, their eyes wide with awe. Before leaving, Hawk turned to face Eleanor one last time. He raised 2 fingers to his temple in a crisp, respectful salute. The others followed his lead, a synchronized gesture that sent shivers through the crowd. Dozens of leather-gloved hands raised in unison, saluting the woman who had once seen humanity where others saw hopelessness. Eleanor lifted her trembling hand and returned the gesture. Her smile was small but radiant, like sunlight breaking through clouds. Around her, the townspeople stood in silence. It wasn't the kind of silence that comes from uncertainty. It was reverence, gratitude, understanding. And then, just as suddenly as they had come, the bikers began to move. Engines roared in harmony as the line stretched down the street, a wave of black and chrome cutting through the gold of late afternoon. Tires hissed against wet asphalt, reflections flashing across puddles like sparks of memory. People stepped aside, some clapping quietly, others wiping their eyes. Children waved. Eleanor stood rooted on her porch, watching until the last tail light disappeared over the hill. The echo of engines lingered in the air long after they were gone, like a heartbeat refusing to fade. The neighbors slowly dispersed, their faces contemplative. Even those who hadn't spoken to her in years came forward now, offering small smiles, nods, or awkward hugs. Something unspoken had shifted among them, a recalibration of what kindness looked like. The moral clarity of the moment settled over the town like the last notes of a hymn. Sometimes kindness looks like rebellion, and compassion like a leather jacket. That thought stayed with her long after the noise faded. The sun slipped lower, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. Eleanor sat on the edge of her porch, her hands folded. Around the tiny metal star Hawk had given her, its surface warm from her touch. For the first time in years, she didn't feel the ache of loneliness pressing on her chest. She felt something deeper, an impact that reached beyond her, beyond Maple Ridge, beyond time itself. Down the street, where the last of the engines had turned out of sight, the faint sound of thunder rolled again, far off, but steady. She smiled, recognizing it instantly. It wasn't the weather. It was a promise, carried on. 2 wheels, moving toward whatever waited beyond the next horizon. And somewhere, in that distance between past and present, the story that had begun in a small classroom was still riding on, gathering new souls into its wake. The sound of the engines faded slowly, the rumble stretching into the distance until it became part of the wind itself. Maple Ridge stood in stillness, the kind of silence that follows something extraordinary, not the quiet of emptiness, but of reverence. The last rays of sunlight poured down over the street, washing the asphalt in liquid gold. Dust swirled gently in the air, glowing like fireflies suspended between worlds. For the first time in years, Eleanor's porch felt alive again, as though the house itself was exhaling after holding its breath for too long. She stayed there, standing on those worn wooden boards, her hand still raised in that final wave long after the last motorcycle vanished beyond the bend. The air was heavy with meaning, with the weight of what had just happened, the unplanned reunion of a lifetime, the closing of a circle that had once seemed too wide to complete. She lowered her hand slowly, feeling both old and timeless in the same heartbeat. Somewhere deep inside her, the years folded neatly into one another. The young teacher defending a frightened boy, the aging woman fighting to keep her dignity, the survivor who now understood the full impact of a single act of faith. There had been a time when she thought her work was measured in grades and test scores, in classroom decorations and lesson plans. But standing there, surrounded by the echoes of motorcycles and gratitude, she realized her legacy wasn't written on paper at all. It was written in people. The neighbors were still outside, talking quietly among themselves. For once, their voices weren't tinted with gossip or speculation. They spoke softly, almost humbly, like people trying to process the magnitude of what they'd just witnessed. One of the younger men, the same who had once scoffed at Jake's name, looked at Eleanor with new eyes. "He turned out all right, didn't he said under his breath. Eleanor smiled, the kind of smile that carried both forgiveness and understanding. "He always was," she said simply. It wasn't pride that filled her. It was something deeper, steadier. The realization that transformation doesn't always look grand while it's happening. Sometimes it takes decades to reveal itself. Sometimes it returns to you on the back of a motorcycle, headlights cutting through the fog, proof that the seeds you planted in the dark eventually found the light. She stepped off the porch and walked a few paces down the road, her shoes pressing softly into damp gravel. The scent of rain and oil still hung in the air, mixed with faint traces of exhaust, oddly comforting, like incense from a sacred ritual. The horizon ahead shimmered faintly, the sun sinking low enough to set the world on fire. She imagined Jake and his riders out there cutting through back roads and highways, their laughter swallowed by the wind. The thought brought a sense of calm she hadn't felt in years. "He's free now," she murmured to herself. "They all are." The echo of her own words felt both like closure and beginning. For decades she had carried guilt, the kind that attaches itself to every failure, every student who slipped through her fingers. But today, that weight had lifted. She realized that not everyone she'd tried to save had been lost. Some had just taken longer routes back home. Inside her living room, the repaired fence outside framed the view like a painting. The walls glowed warm with sunset, and the light made everything look softer. The books on the shelf, the photographs she'd long since stopped dusting, the old coffee mug with its chipped rim. She sat down slowly, fingers brushing over the mug's faded blue star. It was scratched and imperfect, but that imperfection was what made it beautiful. It carried the story of a boy who had once believed he was beyond saving and the woman who had refused to believe it. Outside, a car passed by slowly. The driver waved through the open window. Someone from town, maybe one of her former students grown older. She waved back instinctively, her hand steady. The road stretched far beyond her view, but now it no longer felt lonely. It felt connected, as if every path, every decision, every heartbreak had led to this exact moment of quiet redemption. Her mind wandered through memories like pages of an old journal, the school corridors, the noise of children, the arguments in the principal's office, the lonely nights of grading papers she wasn't sure anyone would remember. She realized now that she hadn't been teaching subjects. She had been teaching survival, the courage to choose kindness in a world that rewards cruelty, the bravery to see humanity where others see threat. That was her curriculum. That was her hidden truth. If someone had told her back then that her greatest student would one day lead a brotherhood of outcasts and misfits to rebuild her home, she might have laughed at the absurdity. But life has its own poetic symmetry, the kind that hides behind chaos until you step back far enough to see the pattern. And now, watching the light melt over the hills, she could see it clearly. Every small decision, every time she had chosen to believe rather than condemn, had brought her here. She whispered quietly, almost like a prayer. "You did good, Jake." The words drifted into the open air, carried away by the fading wind. Somewhere, far down the highway, Hawk might have felt it. A warmth that didn't come from the sun, but from the memory of her voice. Perhaps he turned slightly in his seat, catching a glimpse of the horizon and realizing that for once he wasn't chasing something. He was leading it. Back in Maple Ridge, the world moved on. Children rode their bikes past the freshly repaired fence, their laughter replacing the sound of engines. The neighbors waved when they saw Eleanor outside, some out of respect, others out of guilt. But she didn't hold grudges. She never had. Redemption, she thought, isn't just for the fallen. It's for everyone who finally learns to see differently. As the last light of day slipped behind the hills, the sky turned to a bruised shade of purple and gold. Eleanor leaned against the railing of her porch, arms crossed lightly, the breeze playing with strands of her hair. Her heart was calm, not the restless kind of peace that demands answers, but the settled kind that comes after you've seen the full arc of a story, the rise, the fall, the return. She had lived long enough to witness the consequences of courage, and that was a gift few ever get. Inside, the clock ticked softly, each second marking the rhythm of a life reclaimed. She took a deep breath, feeling the air fill her chest, the same air that had once been thick with dust and worry. The difference now was invisible but enormous. She wasn't surviving anymore. She was seeing again. Her gaze lifted once more toward the fading road. The horizon was painted in orange and violet streaks, the world glowing like an ember refusing to go out. She could still hear it faintly, that deep rhythmic growl in the distance. It wasn't thunder, it was the road remembering. In that moment, her thoughts formed into something like narration, a reflection rising unbidden but true. She taught one boy to believe in himself. He taught 100 men what honor means. She let the words settle in her heart, knowing they would never leave. It wasn't just a summary of what had happened, it was the distilled essence of her life's work. Proof that influence doesn't die when the classroom doors close. It rides on, through lives and choices, through every act of mercy and defiance it inspires. A cool breeze swept across the porch, carrying the scent of rain and asphalt, the ghost of gasoline and redemption. The world around her felt expansive, open, as if every road, visible or not, led to light. Eleanor closed her eyes and smiled. The horizon shimmered one last time, then blurred gently as the first stars appeared above. Somewhere, the sound of an engine echoed faintly again, a final reminder that every story worth telling leaves something behind to guide those who come after. And as the screen of life seemed to fade into its quiet twilight, her voice lingered like a heartbeat, steady and sure. A whisper carried across the miles, bridging darkness and dawn. Even on the darkest roads, there are still those who fight for the light. It's strange, isn't it? How a simple act of belief can travel so far, touching lives you'll never even meet. Maybe that's the quiet magic hidden inside stories like this. They remind us that kindness doesn't vanish. It just changes form. And if you've made it all the way here, maybe that means a part of this story resonated with you too. I'd really like to know what it was. Was it Eleanor's faith in a lost boy, Jake's return, or maybe the idea that redemption doesn't always look polished? Sometimes it arrives on two wheels, covered in rain and gratitude. Tell me what stayed with you most in the comments below. I read every one of them, and your reflections make these stories come alive in ways I could never script alone. And if this journey spoke to you, if it reminded you of something you once lost, or someone who once believed in you, go ahead and tap the like button. It's a small gesture, but it helps keep this space alive for stories that matter. If you're new here, consider subscribing. Not out of obligation, but because this channel is a quiet corner for people who still believe in light, even when the road gets dark. Every story here carries a heartbeat of hope, of justice, of second chances, and I'd be honored to have you ride along for the next one. There's another video right here that continues this journey, a story that explores what happens when redemption finds someone who stopped believing they deserved it. Click and come with me there. I think you'll feel at home. Thanks for staying with me until the end. Let's keep finding the light, one story at a time.